The world finds itself at a crossroads, with two crises on the global stage that have the potential to reshape international relations for decades to come. On one side, in Eastern Europe, the geopolitical tensions between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine continue to escalate. On the other, in the Middle East, a fragile ceasefire in Gaza raises questions about the long-term impact on peace and the region's future. Both stories, though distinct in their geographic and political contexts, share an underlying theme: the balance of power, the pursuit of strategic interests, and the role of military force in achieving those objectives. We begin with the situation in Eastern Europe, where the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has drawn in major global players, particularly the United States. The war that started in 2022 has been marked by a fierce battle for influence, territory, and resources. Ukraine, with support from Western allies, has been fighting to reclaim territory occupied by Russian forces. However, the situation has become more complex with each passing month, as Russia's strategic calculus shifts and the stakes for the global order continue to rise. At the heart of this escalation is the United States' role in the conflict. U.S. President Donald Trump's statements about potentially supplying Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles have sent shockwaves through the international community. These missiles, which can travel up to 2,500 kilometers, could significantly alter the course of the conflict. The prospect of such advanced weaponry in the hands of Ukrainian forces raises the possibility of strikes deep into Russian territory, targeting critical military and industrial infrastructure. This move, however, is not without significant geopolitical consequences. Russia has long viewed the West's involvement in the conflict as an existential threat. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly warned that any direct military support for Ukraine from the United States would cross a red line. For Moscow, the provision of Tomahawk missiles would be seen as an escalation, a signal that the U.S. is no longer merely providing indirect assistance through intelligence, weapons, and training, but is actively engaging in the conflict. The Kremlin has made it clear that if Ukraine uses these weapons to strike Russian territory, Russia would treat the United States as a direct belligerent in the war. Putin's warning is not an idle threat. The historical context is critical in understanding Russia's perspective. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a traumatic event for Russia, and its leaders have long been determined to prevent any further encroachment of NATO and Western influence on its borders. Over the years, Russia has repeatedly emphasized the importance of its security interests in the region. This includes the belief that any move to arm Ukraine with advanced weaponry, particularly long-range strike capabilities like the Tomahawk missile, represents a fundamental threat to Russian security. Moreover, Russia has made it clear that it views any nation providing Ukraine with such advanced weapons as an enemy. The Kremlin has stated that if the U.S. were to follow through with its plans to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, it would consider that a direct act of aggression, and the U.S. would be held accountable. This stance is not a new one, and it has its roots in Russia's past military doctrines. During the Obama administration, for instance, Russia had already warned the U.S. about the consequences of arming Ukraine, even warning that such actions could lead to a breakdown in relations and the suspension of arms control agreements. The fear of escalation is palpable. Providing Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles would be a game-changer. These missiles, developed in the 1990s, are not the most advanced weapons in the world, but they are highly effective in modern warfare. Their range, precision, and stealth capabilities make them a formidable tool for any nation seeking to exert military pressure. For Ukraine, these missiles could provide the ability to strike Russian targets deep behind enemy lines, potentially crippling Russia's logistical and industrial capabilities. However, the strategic implications of such a move extend far beyond the battlefield. The provision of Tomahawk missiles could be the spark that ignites a larger, more dangerous conflict, one that draws in NATO and the U.S. as direct combatants against Russia. Russia has already indicated that it would respond to such a move with military action. Given the stakes involved, this situation could quickly spiral into a broader war with catastrophic consequences for all parties involved. The potential for nuclear escalation, which many analysts have warned about, would become even more likely if the West continues to push for a deeper military involvement in the conflict. Despite these risks, the U.S. has been relatively firm in its support of Ukraine. The Biden administration, along with several European allies, has continued to provide Ukraine with a steady stream of military aid, including advanced air defense systems, drones, and artillery. But Trump's potential decision to provide Tomahawk missiles would take this support to an entirely new level. It would be seen as a direct military intervention, one that could push the US and Russia closer to the brink of a full-scale war. In addition to the military implications, there are also significant political considerations at play. The decision to provide such powerful weapons would send a clear message to Russia that the US is committed to Ukraine's defense no matter the cost. This move would be a powerful symbol of American resolve, but it would also further cement the divide between Russia and the West. The diplomatic fallout could be severe, with Russia likely retaliating by taking even more aggressive actions in Ukraine or in other parts of Europe. The possibility of a broader conflict in Europe would have profound implications for NATO and its future role in the world order. The global balance of power would also be altered by such a decision. NATO's credibility as a military alliance would be put to the test. For decades, NATO has stood as a bulwark against Russian expansionism, but the alliance's ability to effectively deter Russia has been increasingly questioned. If the US provides Ukraine with Tomahawks, it would send a message that NATO is willing to take unprecedented steps to counter Russian aggression. But that message could come with a high price, one that includes the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia, the world's largest nuclear power. As tensions continue to rise both in Ukraine and on the global stage, the situation remains fluid. The provision of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine is still a decision to be made, and the outcome of this debate will shape the course of the conflict for years to come. The risk of escalation is real, and the stakes have never been higher. Turning our attention to the Middle East, the Gaza Strip has long been a focal point of conflict, humanitarian crises, and political maneuvering. The first phase of the ceasefire agreement, facilitated under the auspices of US President Trump, was announced with great fanfare. International media highlighted it as a potential breakthrough, offering a glimmer of hope in a region long defined by bloodshed and instability. Yet beneath the surface of celebration lies a more complex picture, a web of political, military, and social considerations that reveal both the potential and the limitations of this agreement. At the center of this ceasefire are the hostages, Israeli citizens held by Hamas for extended periods. The agreement stipulates that 48 Israeli hostages will be released during this phase. While these lives are of immense human value, their release also carries a symbolic and strategic weight. It is a demonstration of political will and humanitarian concern intended to alleviate domestic pressure on the Israeli government. International observers have noted the dramatic ratio of hostages to prisoners. Israel is expected to release over 1,700 Palestinian detainees in exchange. This disparity, one Israeli hostage for approximately 90 Palestinian prisoners, highlights the asymmetrical priorities embedded in the conflict and the leverage that Israel holds. The announcement of the exchange created a wave of relief and celebration within Israel. Families were reunited with loved ones, and public sentiment shifted toward optimism, at least temporarily. In Gaza, however, the reaction was more complex. Civilians experienced a brief sense of hope, yet the underlying structural issues remained unchanged. The blockade, now one of the longest in the world, continues to constrain the flow of goods, services, and humanitarian aid. Residents face daily challenges: inconsistent electricity, limited access to clean water, inadequate medical services, and an economy under strain. The ceasefire, while momentarily reducing the immediate threat of violence, cannot by itself resolve these systemic problems. Gaza's population has endured repeated cycles of bombardment and conflict, leading to long-term psychological trauma. Studies and field reports document high levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic disorders among both adults and children. Children in particular have grown up witnessing multiple rounds of fighting, often with explosions and casualties occurring near their homes. This chronic exposure has resulted in pervasive mental health issues, affecting learning, social development, and emotional resilience. Parents, themselves coping with trauma, may struggle to provide stable and nurturing environments, compounding the psychological toll on the next generation. The physical infrastructure of Gaza also reflects the intensity of the conflict. Water and sanitation systems have been damaged or destroyed, hospitals operate under resource constraints, and essential services are limited. Frequent power outages exacerbate the humanitarian situation, while the partial lifting of blockades has not provided consistent access to necessities. This combination of factors has transformed Gaza into what some observers describe as an open-air prison, where survival is a daily struggle and long-term planning is nearly impossible. Reconstruction under the ceasefire is a contentious issue. Although the agreement mentions rebuilding Gaza, the reality is more complex. Effective reconstruction requires substantial funding, logistical coordination, and oversight. More critically, if the process is dominated by external actors, whether states or international organizations, the autonomy and dignity of Gaza's residents may be compromised. Decisions regarding infrastructure, economic development, and local governance could be made without meaningful local input, further entrenching dependency and limiting self-determination. For Hamas, exclusion from the reconstruction process threatens to erode its economic and political influence, reshaping the balance of power in the region. Israel's military and political objectives are intertwined with this process. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government have consistently prioritized the neutralization of Hamas as a military and political actor. The ceasefire, while presented as a temporary humanitarian measure, aligns with broader strategic goals, mitigating international criticism, demonstrating responsiveness to global opinion, and creating conditions for long-term security control in Gaza. In this context, the return of hostages serves dual purposes. It satisfies immediate humanitarian and political pressures while providing leverage for future actions. The complexity of internal Israeli politics further affects the ceasefire's implementation. Netanyahu's coalition government is composed of multiple parties, some of which hold hardline positions on Gaza and oppose any concessions to Hamas. These internal dynamics limit flexibility and can generate tensions when implementing agreements. The defense minister and other influential figures have voiced opposition to partial withdrawals or even minor prisoner exchanges, demanding that Hamas be fully dismantled. Such political pressures ensure that the ceasefire must be navigated carefully, balancing domestic expectations with international commitments. Meanwhile, external actors, particularly the United States, play a crucial role in mediating and supervising the ceasefire. Trump publicly pledged to coordinate funding from Arab states to support Gaza's reconstruction, while asserting U.S. oversight over the rebuilding process. This approach consolidates influence in the region, ensuring that key strategic objectives are maintained even as humanitarian needs are addressed. By controlling reconstruction efforts, external powers can shape the trajectory of Gaza's political and economic recovery, potentially marginalizing local actors and determining the future balance of authority. The marginalization of historical intermediaries, such as Egypt, further illustrates the shift in regional dynamics. Egypt has traditionally served as a broker for negotiations and hostage exchanges between Hamas and Israel. Under the new framework, its influence is reduced, enhancing the strategic leverage of the United States and Israel. This reconfiguration of influence reflects a broader trend: the consolidation of power among external actors at the expense of regional intermediaries, which has implications for both diplomacy and local agency. The humanitarian dimension of the ceasefire is inseparable from its political and strategic context. While the first phase provides a temporary respite, it cannot address the underlying structural challenges of Gaza. Issues such as long-term access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities, and social services remain unresolved. Without significant and sustained support that empowers local governance structures, the risk of renewed conflict remains high. The ceasefire's true success will depend not only on the immediate reduction of hostilities but also on the creation of durable conditions for civilian life, including security, mobility, and the restoration of basic services. Psychologically, the population of Gaza remains vulnerable. Decades of exposure to conflict, combined with the pressures of living under blockade, have created deep-seated trauma. The release of hostages, while momentarily uplifting, does not alleviate the cumulative mental health challenges facing both children and adults. Programs aimed at psychological support, social cohesion, and education are crucial to breaking the cycle of trauma. Otherwise, the underlying conditions for radicalization, revenge, and intergenerational trauma persist, leaving the region in a fragile equilibrium. In summary, the Gaza ceasefire demonstrates the complexity of negotiating peace in a region marked by long-standing conflict, deep structural inequalities, and competing strategic interests. It highlights the tension between short-term humanitarian gains and long-term strategic objectives. While the first phase has yielded visible outcomes, hostage releases, partial withdrawals, and a temporary reduction in violence, the underlying political, social, and infrastructural challenges remain. The ceasefire serves as a strategic pause rather than a definitive resolution, with the people of Gaza still navigating a landscape of uncertainty, control, and survival. As we look ahead, the geopolitical landscape is fraught with uncertainty. The decisions being made today in both Eastern Europe and the Middle East will have long-lasting effects on global stability, international relations, and the future of regions caught in conflict. In both Ukraine and Gaza, the immediate actions of world powers, along with the strategic goals of regional actors, will determine whether these crises will lead to a new era of confrontation or pave the way for meaningful peace. The stakes are high, and the paths taken by the United States, Russia, Israel, and Hamas will shape the world's future for years to come. Starting with Ukraine. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has already altered the trajectory of global politics. The war has intensified NATO's role in Europe and has sparked debates about the future of the alliance and its mission. In many ways, the battle for Ukraine is not just a territorial dispute, but a struggle over the future of Europe's security architecture. Should Ukraine remain within Russia's sphere of influence, or should it join the Western Bloc, becoming a member of NATO and the European Union? The answers to these questions will reshape the European balance of power for the next century. The potential provision of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine is just one example of how this war is far from over. As President Trump weighs his options, the decision to escalate military involvement further could trigger a series of events that extend far beyond Ukraine. With each missile provided, the risk of Russian retaliation increases, and the likelihood of direct military engagement between the US and Russia rises. The potential for a broader war, one that could involve multiple nations and escalate into a nuclear confrontation, remains a very real threat. This is a crossroads moment for the international community. Leaders in the US and Europe are grappling with difficult decisions, trying to balance the need to support Ukraine with the imperative to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. If the United States provides Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, it is signaling a willingness to confront Russia head-on, a move that could either solidify NATO's resolve or fracture the alliance. The outcomes are unclear, but one thing is certain. The decision will have a profound impact on the future of NATO, US-Russia relations, and the stability of Europe itself. In parallel, the situation in Gaza offers a similarly precarious future. While the first phase of the ceasefire agreement may have brought temporary relief to both Israeli and Palestinian civilians, it is only a small step in the much larger challenge of achieving lasting peace in the region. The fundamental issues, territorial disputes, the status of Jerusalem, and the question of Palestinian statehood remain unresolved. Without addressing these core issues, any ceasefire or peace agreement risks becoming yet another temporary pause, rather than a genuine solution. The role of external actors in Gaza's future is also crucial. The United States and Israel, having played key roles in the ceasefire negotiation, are now positioned as the primary influences on Gaza's reconstruction and political future. However, if the reconstruction process is managed by external powers, it raises questions about the sovereignty and autonomy of the Gaza population. What will be the cost of rebuilding Gaza if the region's future is determined by outsiders, rather than by the people who have lived through the conflict? What will happen to Gaza's internal politics if Hamas is excluded from the rebuilding process, further isolating the group and diminishing its influence? The involvement of Arab states under US coordination also has profound implications. While these states may offer financial support for Gaza's reconstruction, the question remains, Will this aid be used to empower local governance and facilitate true reconstruction, or will it serve as another tool for external control, shaping the region's political landscape in a way that suits the interests of foreign powers? The potential for a lasting peace in Gaza hinges not only on the cessation of hostilities, but on the equitable distribution of power and resources in the post-conflict era. If Gaza's political and economic future remains under external control, the prospects for peace will be slim and the cycle of violence will likely continue. As for the future of Hamas, it remains unclear whether the group will be able to adapt to the changing dynamics in Gaza. Exclusion from the reconstruction process, coupled with the erosion of its political and economic power, could weaken Hamas's ability to govern. This raises the question of whether Hamas can survive in the long term, or if it will be forced to adapt its strategy to survive. Similarly, Israel's long-term strategy of eradicating Hamas, while politically appealing, carries significant risks. The more Israel attempts to eliminate Hamas through military means, the more entrenched the group becomes in the fabric of Palestinian society. This cycle of violence only deepens the rift between Israelis and Palestinians and further alienates those who might otherwise seek peace. The broader implications for the region are equally concerning. As Gaza's future remains uncertain, the ripple effects are felt throughout the Middle East. The stability of neighboring countries, including Egypt and Jordan, depends on how the Gaza situation is resolved. The failure to achieve a lasting peace will further destabilize the region, exacerbating refugee crises, spreading extremism, and potentially drawing in other powers, including Iran and Saudi Arabia. This broader regional instability presents a challenge for global leaders who are already struggling to address crises in other parts of the world. The Middle East is a key theater of geopolitical competition, and the Gaza conflict is at the center of that competition. The actions of the United States, Israel, and regional actors will have a lasting impact on the future of the region and the global order. If the situation in Gaza deteriorates further, it will have consequences far beyond the borders of the Gaza Strip, affecting international trade, security, and the global balance of power. In conclusion, the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza are far from over, and the decisions made by world leaders today will shape the future of global politics. In Ukraine, the risk of escalation into a larger conflict remains high, with the potential for a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. In Gaza, the ceasefire has brought temporary relief, but has done little to address the underlying issues that have fueled the conflict for decades. The future of both regions hangs in the balance, and the choices made by the United States, Russia, Israel, and other powers will determine the course of history. For Ukraine, the decision to provide Tomahawk missiles will define the future of its conflict with Russia and the fate of NATO. For Gaza, the question remains whether this ceasefire is a genuine opportunity for peace, or merely a strategic maneuver in a long-running game of geopolitical chess. Whatever the outcome, the world must remain vigilant, as the consequences of these decisions will be felt far beyond the borders of Eastern Europe and the Middle East.